我们要继承和弘扬联合国宪章的宗旨和原则，构建以合作共赢为核心的新型国际关系，打造人类命运共同体。
Hello and welcome to another Vision China. I'm Owen Fishwick from China Daily.
And I'm Hu Zhe from China Daily.
Today's edition of Vision China will look at the important work that China has done, along with the United Nations and its members, in poverty reduction, world peace and sustainable development.
This year marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. And over the past 75 years, the UN has taken an active role in safeguarding world peace and development. 2020 is also a landmark year for China, as the country is set to realize its target of eliminating absolute poverty. In this episode of Vision China, we will look at how the UN and China have worked together toward achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals.
So, welcome to Vision China, shaping our future together. Poverty eradication and peaceful development. But first, let's welcome our honourable guests. They are Ma Jiashu, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs;
Guo Weiming, Vice Minister of the State Council Information Office;
Zhou Shuchun, Publisher and Editor-in-Chief of China Daily.
And today we're honored to have a special guest from the UN, Amina J. Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and Chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group. And as for the guest speakers of today's event, we are joined by senior diplomats, scholars, and experts who will give their take on the contributions of the UN and China in poverty eradication, sustainable development, and global stability. And they are Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, President of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network;
Kishore Mahbubani, former Singaporean Ambassador to the United Nations;
Gert Johannes Grabler, former Senior Diplomat in the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation;
Martin Jacks, Senior Fellow of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University. But first, to deliver opening remarks, Ma Jiashu, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs.
I want to begin by thanking Vision China for inviting me to talk about this very important topic for both China and the United Nations: poverty eradication and peaceful development. 75 years ago, when the world finally emerged from the rubble of the World War II, nations came together to found the United Nations. In the years since, the United Nations has lived up to its role as the most representative, authoritative, and comprehensive platform of international cooperation, and has made tremendous contribution to world peace, stability, and common development. Today, our world is facing unprecedented challenges. COVID-19 is still spreading. The world economy is in deep recession. Efforts to implement the 2030 agenda is suffering major setbacks. An estimate of 70 to 100 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty. Yet, despite these challenges and the profound changes we are facing and seeing in the century, peace and development remains the defining trend of our times and the shared aspiration of the people across the world. So it has become ever more important that we stand firmly committed to multilateralism with the United Nations at its core, and combine our efforts towards our community, our shared future for mankind. To be successful in that endeavor, we must do right four things. First, we must safeguard the international system with the UN at its core. The Charter of the United Nations is not only the constituent instrument of the United Nations as an organization, it is also a legal manifesto encompassing the basic principles and norms of its 193 member states. Faithfully observing the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and upholding the international order based on international law is crucial for world peace and development. We must reject any act that undermines the norms governing international relations. And we must act together to defeat the attempt of certain countries to start a so-called new Cold War. Second, we must uphold multilateralism. Decisions on world affairs need to be made through consultation and dialogue. No country should be allowed to dominate over others. Any attempt to bring back the law of the jungle and barbarism is a lost cause. While multilateralism gives us solutions and options, unilateralism will only lead us astray to a dead end. It is a choice between the right and wrong. When a certain country goes full steam with its unilateralism, protectionism, and bullyism, breaking commitments and backstepping from international cooperation, the whole world is paying a heavy price. We must say no to these acts of unilateralism and bullying, and jointly promote a new type of international relations based on mutual respect, fairness, and justice, and win-win cooperation. Third, we must prioritize development on the agenda. Development is the master key to all problems, and poverty eradication deserves our most strategic focus. We must leverage the decade of action for sustainable development goals, support the work of the United Nations Alliance for Poverty Eradication, and jointly advance cooperation on poverty eradication and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. The principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is crucial and must be upheld. We urge the developed countries to honor their ODA commitments on time and in full, and provide adequate and stable capital, technical, and capacity building support to the developing countries. Economic growth is the fundamental driving force for poverty eradication and development. We must strive for a safe and orderly return to work and maintain the stability and integrity of the global industrial and supply chains. To this end, during the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting earlier this month, State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China put forward a Chinese initiative on facilitating cross-border flow of people and goods. We welcome all interested parties to join this initiative. It is also important that the international community implement the Paris Agreement to achieve a green recovery. Continue on the point of development, I want to emphasize that every country in this world is entitled to development. It is an inherent right of all nations. Alarmingly, some countries now trying to monopolize the right, using threats, coercion, and sanction to deny the right to development of other countries. But make no mistake, such despicable acts are doomed to failure. Fourth, we must continue to strive for a community of shared future for mankind. This pandemic has taught us a good lesson. We have come to realize more keenly than ever before that all countries' interests are closely interconnected and the whole humanity share a common destiny. Only by standing together can we defeat the pandemic. We support the continued leading and coordinating role of the United Nations and the World Health Organization in this fight. And we call on everyone to reject politicization, stigma, blame game, and scapegoating. Despite the strong headwinds, we must remain committed to win-win cooperation and continue to steer economic globalization in the right direction. Ladies and gentlemen, as the first country to sign the UN Charter, and as a responsible country and permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, China supports the important role of the United Nations and upholds the UN's authority and core status in the international system. No matter how the world changes, China will always stand firmly committed to building peace, promoting development, maintaining international order, and providing global public goods. Our resolve to safeguard multilateralism, fairness, and justice will never waver. Our resolve to push for just and reasonable solution to hotspot issues and to bring about a more fair, just, and reasonable international order will never waver. Our resolve to build a community of shared future for mankind will never waver. And our resolve to jointly promote the Belt and Road Initiative and achieve the SDGs will never waver. As the world's largest developing country, China takes poverty eradication as a central priority. From end of 2012 to end of 2019, impoverished population in China had reduced from 98.99 million to 5.51 million, with poverty incidence rate dropping from 10.2% to 0.6%. For 7 years in a row, 10 million plus people were helped out of poverty annually. In total, China has successfully lifted more than 700 million people out of poverty during the 4 decades and more reform and opening up, accounting for over 70% of poverty reduction worldwide in the same period. Tarmac and cement roads have been paved in all administrative villages where conditions allow. All villages have had clinics and medical practitioners. Over 99.9% of registered poor population have been covered by the basic medical care insurance. Reliability ratio of rural power grid has reached 99%, and the teaching conditions of 108,000 compulsory education schools have been improved. Our poverty eradication endeavors have profoundly changed the lives of many people. In the ethnic Yi Autonomous Prefecture, Yunnan Province, a woman artisan named Li Chongmei not only lifted herself out of poverty by making embroidery pieces, but also motivated many others to follow together. They have successfully explored the path to better life through stay-at-home businesses, while at the same time helped preserving ethnic culture and traditional craftsmanship. In a poverty-stricken village in the Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region, Dr. Li Yan, an agriculturalist, runs a vegetable farming service business. Dr. Li has spent 28 years traveling to all corners of the region, teaching science-based vegetable farming, empowering many peasants to end poverty for good. There are numerous stories such as these. There are millions of Chinese people like Li Chongmei and Li Yan. Through relentless efforts, they have shaken off poverty and achieved a life of affluence and happiness. This year, we are determined to overcome the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, win the battle against poverty, and achieve 10 years ahead of schedule the Sustainable Development Goal of ending extreme poverty, thus making a historic contribution to the global fight against poverty and efforts for peace and development. Going forward, we will continue to fully implement COVID-19 response and cooperation measures that President Xi Jinping outlined at the 73rd World Health Assembly. We will support economic and social development in affected countries, especially developing ones. We will take active steps to set up a global humanitarian response depot and hub in China, and we will continue to implement the G20 debt service suspension initiative for the poorest countries and fulfill the promise of making the COVID-19 vaccine a global public good once it comes out. China stands ready to work with all international partners and make further contribution to the global pandemic response and the world economic recovery. That concludes my remarks today on poverty eradication and peaceful development. I would like to close by wishing the VisionChina program a great success. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Ma. And now let's invite Mr. Guo Weiming, Vice Minister of the State Council Information Office, to say a few words.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's an honor to speak at this virtual VisionChina event. Please allow me, on behalf of the State Council Information Office of China, to extend warm congratulations for the event and express sincere gratitude to our friends who are solicitors and support China's development. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. Also this year, China is committed to win the critical battle to eradicate poverty in rural areas and complete the building of a moderately prosperous society. This event, theme Shaping Our Future Together, Poverty Eradication and Peaceful Development, gathers senior officials, renowned scholars, and international opinion leaders to offer insights about the vision and efforts made by China and the rest of the world in eliminating poverty and pursuing common development. I trust this event will help pour wisdom, build consensus, and provide an impetus to poverty eradication efforts. The world is undergoing profound changes unseen in a century. Human society faces both hope and challenges. President Xi Jinping pointed out on various occasions that with deepening multipolarity, economic globalization, cultural diversity, and IT development, countries have become more and more interconnected and interdependent, sharing will and war. Humanity has become a global community with a shared future. In the face of unbalanced global development and the widening South-North development gap, we need to uphold the philosophy of win-win cooperation, create a sound condition for shared growth for mankind, and work together to eliminate poverty and backwardness in the world. To this end, we need broad participations and joint efforts from people around the world. We need to build a consensus of people from different countries, ethnicity, and regions with different beliefs and cultures. And we need to turn people's aspiration into a vision and a goal, and translate them into concrete plans and actions. I'd like to avail of this opportunity to share with you my views about China's poverty relief efforts, as well as the world's common development. First, China has contributed its wisdom and solutions to the world in poverty eradication through its targeted efforts. As the largest developing country, China has been a champion, promoter, and contributor in global poverty elimination and development. Its outstanding achievements in lifting a vast population out of poverty has rarely been seen in the world. From 2012 to 2019, China helped more than 10 million people rise out of poverty every year. It is committed to eliminating absolute poverty throughout the country in 2020, creating a China's miracle in the history of mankind's fighting against poverty. As a major player on the international stage, China has shouldered its responsibility for global poverty reduction actively, participated in international cooperation, and contributed wisdom and solutions to global poverty eradication efforts. A research report released by the World Bank indicates that China's Belt and Road Initiative will help 7.6 million people from countries involved shackle of extreme poverty, and 32 million others get out of moderate poverty. China stands ready to work with the international community to stay committed to the great cause of poverty elimination and make joint efforts to build a better world that enjoys common prosperity. Second, China has provided direction to global human rights governance with its concrete actions in poverty eliminations. China pursues a people-centered development philosophy. While trying to reduce poverty, it puts people first and foremost, upholding social fairness and justice, and promoting people's overall development. From its birth, the Communist Party of China has made it its mission to seek happiness for the people and pursue development for mankind. Over the past decades, China has explored a path with Chinese characteristics for human rights development, which features eliminating poverty through promoting development and enhancing human rights through poverty relief. This way, China has not accelerated the process of international poverty eradication, but also provided an example for improving global human rights governance. As always, China will remain committed to strengthening efforts in global poverty reduction, improving the well-being of mankind, and making every effort to make global human rights governance more fair and just. Third, China has injected energy and momentum into the building of a community with a shared future for mankind through international cooperation. President Xi Jinping has said that advancing a new type of relationship with win-win cooperation at the core, to develop international exchanges and cooperation in poverty elimination significantly contributes to eradicating poverty globally. China upholds the philosophy of globalization that is open, inclusive, and balanced with benefits shared by all. It remains committed to global poverty elimination and strives to advancing the building of a new structure of international cooperation in poverty reduction. By establishing the China UN Peace and Development Fund, an assistance fund for South-South cooperation and conducting poverty relief training, the country has boosted momentum for global poverty reduction efforts, creating more opportunity and better conditions for developing countries to break the bottlenecks in development and tap the potential for shaking off poverty. China's efforts in global poverty reduction conform to the trend of the times, meet the common aspiration of people around the world, and fully demonstrate the country's vision of building a community with a shared future for mankind. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, in 2016, the world began implementing the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with a view to eradicating poverty in all forms. However, it is obvious that various difficulties still remain and undoubted efforts are needed to reach the goal on time. Particularly, the COVID-19 pandemic poses grave challenges to global poverty reduction efforts. Unfortunately, protectionism, unilateralism, and populism that are on the rise in some countries have cast a shadow on achieving the goal of global poverty reduction and development. As a Chinese saying goes, all flowers in full blossom make a beautiful spring. The Chinese people hold the strong belief that only through solidarity and mutual assistance can the world overcome challenges. China will work with the rest of the world to push forward the process of the international poverty reduction, firmly uphold multilateralism and the international system with the United Nations at the core, strive for win-win cooperation, and make tireless efforts to build a better world that enjoys common prosperity and keeps away poverty. Again, I wish the event a great success and the participants good health. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guo. Now, to deliver his opening remarks, Zhou Shuchun, publisher and editor-in-chief of China Daily.
Distinguished guests, dear friends, welcome to Vision China at this critical juncture in history for the discussion on shaping our future together, poverty eradication and peaceful development, with respect to relations between China and the United Nations. 20 years ago, the Millennium Summit of the United Nations set the Millennium Development Goals, with poverty eradication being the primary target. Thanks to unwavering efforts in the following years, great headway has been made. Countries have been working hard to realize the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As the most populous nation in the world, China met the development goals as early as 5 years ago, becoming the first developing country to reach the poverty relief target. Led by President Xi Jinping, 1.4 billion Chinese people are striving to eliminate absolute poverty in the country by the end of this year, and will also build a moderately prosperous society in all respects, the first of China's 2 centenary goals. This marks a historic step to wipe out absolute poverty that has plagued the nation for centuries. Undoubtedly, it will also have a strong effect on global efforts in poverty eradication. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in the message, to the Global Poverty Reduction and Development Forum in October 2017. Targeted poverty reduction strategies are the only way to reach those farthest behind and achieve the ambitious targets set out in the 2030 Agenda. China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and its experiences can provide valuable lessons to other developing countries. 75 years ago, countries pooled their wisdom following World War II and established the United Nations, leading to the emergence of an intergovernmental organization that is most universal, most internationally represented, and most authoritative. They adopted the UN Charter, laying the cornerstone of the contemporary international order and establishing the fundamental principles of contemporary international relations. Today, the profound changes not seen in a century are evolving rapidly, and there are mounting uncertainties in the international landscape. The COVID-19 pandemic poses new challenges to global development, and humankind is once again standing at a crossroads. As a major responsible country, China has been advocating the building of an open, inclusive, clean, and beautiful world that enjoys lasting peace, universal security, and common prosperity. President Xi has said, "Our world is full of both hope and challenges. We should not give up on our dreams only because the reality around us is too complicated. We should not stop pursuing our ideals only because they seem out of our reach. Now is the time to draw on historical experience and look to the future, and also to firm up our beliefs and be clear about where we want to go. The world needs to make the right choice between going back or going forward. No matter what we are, media people or business people, scholars or diplomats, politicians or common folks, we should stand on the right side of history and push for human civilization to make new progress in facing up to the challenges. First, we should firmly safeguard world peace. More than 70 years of peace, by and large, after the Second World War, has been fundamental in ensuring that humanity achieves development and progress, and people enjoy security and happiness. Unilateralism and hegemony, as well as Cold War mentality and zero-sum games, which are on the rise nowadays, have become stumbling blocks to world peace and stability. The preamble to the Constitution of UNESCO declares that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. We should keep those words in mind and resolutely reject acts that attempt to undermine solidarity and create division in the international community. We should advance the building of a community with a shared future for mankind and make every effort to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, as was inscribed in the preamble of the Charter of the United Nations. Second, we should actively promote global development. Development holds the key to solving problems in the world, as well as addressing the concerns of the international community. the COVID-19 pandemic has led to an unprecedented impact on global development. While tackling challenges arising from the spread of the virus, we are also confronted with the shadow caused by some countries politicizing the virus instead of seeking international cooperation. We have to deal with the fallout of the pandemic on the global economy, even as we face an environment that has become more complicated due to the headwinds of anti-globalization. While making a choice between isolation and openness, or decoupling and cooperation, we must remain committed to building an open world economy and make economic globalization more open, inclusive, and balanced so that its benefits can be shared by all. Third, we must staunchly uphold the international order. As President Xi has said, the more complex and grave the situation is, the more important it is to demonstrate the authority and role of the United Nations. The changes of the world over the past 7 decades have demonstrated that the United Nations plays an irreplaceable role in responding to major global challenges. We must back the international order and the international system with the principles of the UN Charter at the core, advance the building of international relations featuring mutual respect, fairness, and justice, and win-win cooperation, and make sure international politics move forward to a brighter future. Thank you.
And now to deliver a special message to Vision China, Amina J. Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and Chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group.
It is a pleasure to address this Vision China event on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. We have marked this anniversary not with celebration, but through a global conversation on how to address the challenges we face and promote peace and sustainable development. I'm grateful to China Daily for this contribution to our dialogue. 75 years ago, world leaders acted with vision and pragmatism, recognizing that cooperation and compromise were in their national interest. Today, solidarity is even more essential to our survival. COVID-19 has made that painfully clear. COVID-19 has shown that our multilateral institutions are essential. We need to use every tool at our disposal to turn this crisis into an opportunity. That will ensure we recover better and that we deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. That means transforming our institutions so they are more inclusive, responsive, and accountable. That will mean ensuring just transitions to green economies, empowering the next generation of young people. Across the world, there is overwhelming support for multilateralism. People want collective action to address the pandemic, climate change, and conflict. They want to see our world transformed, and they want to play their part. That message has emerged clearly from the UN 75 global conversation. We must rise to this challenge. The past few months have shown that huge changes are possible when political will is aligned with public support. In many instances, we have seen people working in unison with governments to implement large-scale social distancing, thereby helping to successfully reduce the spread of the virus while maintaining social and community solidarity. As we strive to recover better, the Sustainable Development Goals remain our agreed universal roadmap. And this moment must be our turning point. We must use the 75th anniversary to signal our resolve. I look to you all to make this moment count for people and planet. Thank you.
Thanks. And now it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our first speaker, Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, President of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And he will be discussing how sustainable development can be the path to happiness. And here's a short video about him.
The idea of sustainable development is that the whole world should enjoy an economic system that is prosperous, that is fair, and that is environmentally sustainable. So the idea of sustainable development is to combine the economic objectives, the social justice, and the environmental sustainability. It's an extremely important concept because it basically points to a good life for everybody on the planet. And the United Nations member states, all 193, have twice confirmed the commitment to sustainable development. First in 2015 with the Agenda 2030, which is where the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are laid out, and then in the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, we need to achieve what we have set out to do. If we do, the world will be a much better place. China has made major contributions to sustainable development, first and foremost by ending poverty within China, and second, by helping other countries with basic infrastructure through projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. And these are extremely important and positive contributions. I look forward to China playing a leading role in cleaning up the pollution now, because part of sustainable development is moving to a green set of technologies. We need to move to low carbon energy, wind and solar power, electric vehicles, 5G. China has great capacity in all of these areas. And for its own clean air and its own environment, as well as for the world's environment, China's leadership is extremely important in order to achieve environmental sustainability. If you look at China's very rapid growth, especially since 1978, it's been based on three basic pillars. One is investing in health and education of the people. The second has been building infrastructure so that there is power, electricity, connectivity, roads, rail, airports, all as the basis for productivity. And the third is to enable business to create new products and new markets. So it's been really three kinds of investment. Investment in people, investment in infrastructure, and investment in the business economy. And I would say that China, by contributing to the infrastructure in Africa, for example, with electrification in many countries, is helping those countries to achieve the same kind of success that China achieved. That is economic development that is based on these interconnected kinds of investments. So I'm very pleased with initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative or with China's investments in African infrastructure as being part of the solution for getting out of poverty and therefore achieving sustainable development. Globally, there has been a lot of progress up until this year in fighting poverty. The rate of global poverty from 1990 at around 30% or so declined to around 10% by 2015. China played a huge role in that because China was overwhelmingly poor, and then it has basically already by 2015 largely eliminated poverty and now has eliminated all extreme poverty as of this year. But we had two problems. One, there were still hundreds of millions of people living in real desperation, especially in Africa. And second, COVID-19 has been a big setback. Definitely, this is a very, very serious crisis for poor people in many parts of the world. So the challenge is not only to complete a process that was underway, but also to stop this pandemic so that we can recover some of the lost ground this year. So I see a really three-part process. One is ending the epidemic as soon as possible using the methods that China has used, Hopefully we'll have vaccines, China, the United States, and others that could become available in the coming year or two. That's one part. The second part is broad economic development through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. And there, as I mentioned, the key is that these should be anti-pollution, sustainable, renewable energy-based initiatives. And then the third should be targeted help to those places that have still high entrenched poverty, maybe because of their geography or their history. They don't have the basic infrastructure and they need special kind of help. And so here's where China is so good at developing an integrated framework of combining infrastructure and human investments and business development. And I think that China could use its capacity to do that in parts of the world where there still is entrenched poverty. When I was asked to visit Western China in the early 2000s, the idea was that China would use its development planning and its public investments to spur growth in places that had been left behind by the first 20 years of rapid growth. And China did that. Well, there are still places on the planet that have been left behind, in the Sahel of Africa, for example. And China is very good at putting together big investment projects, big industrial projects, and social development, health and education and so forth. With that combination, even these very hard to solve places can also escape from poverty. Of course, SDG 3, which is health for all, is in the forefront because stopping the pandemic is a necessary condition for achieving the rest. I would say that a second major goal that we have learned in recent months is the importance of access to digital technology and electricity, because it has been the digital world that has provided so many crucial tools for us for not only stopping the epidemic, but continuing our work and continuing our services like health and education during this period. So 5G is all the more important. Connectivity is all the more important. And China is the world's biggest internet user. That's been a big feature of being able to contain the epidemic. There are places that need that infrastructure very much now. And I hope that Huawei and others can help to provide it, because this becomes even more important than we recognized in the past. Then a crisis that I think is extremely important to note is that because of the pandemic, hundreds of millions of children have not been in school. And we know that this is crucial for their future. And Jack Ma, among others, has been championing education for young children, especially in Africa. We need to be very creative now to help all of these kids catch up again, to get back to school, and to use online learning, digital learning, and so forth in order to overcome the big obstacles that came with the pandemic this year. So there's a lot of work to do. Then when we think about the global recovery, I would add that the Belt and Road Initiative and the European Union Recovery Fund both point to new public investments to help global recovery. And I would like to see Europe and China cooperate together on this by building a Eurasian sustainable infrastructure of renewable energy, energy interconnection, electric vehicles, smart transport, and so forth. I think there's a big future through public investments in exactly the kinds of technologies that China is pioneering. If our two countries cooperate, and the European Union and the African Union and ASEAN and other parts of the world, we really can achieve an incredible amount now, not only to stop this pandemic, but to use all of these new technologies, the digital world, to make a better world, to ensure that everybody can have access to education, healthcare, and many other basic services. This is all possible right now. The Cold War idea is the worst idea around. It's the last we need. We need multilateral cooperation. China, together with the United States, in founding the UN. But if we look at another important UN document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which talks about economic, social, cultural, political, civil rights, this is also a document that was made with very important Chinese input. It's got a lot of Confucian ideas in it because one of the great scholars that contributed to it, often called one of the main authors of the Universal Declaration, was a great Chinese scholar, also trained in part at my university, at Columbia University. So I think there's so much together we should do. And I personally believe, China as being one of the world's great civilizations, has so much to offer. And the UN is exactly the spirit in which this can be offered, that we should use this occasion to rededicate ourselves to the very core of the UN, which is human dignity, peace, and sustainable development. These are great concepts. Nothing divides our countries on those concepts. They are completely shared concepts for everybody. And so we should work together to achieve them. The situation is very dangerous, and it's mostly the result of U.S. politicians and some U.S. officials who are extremely nationalistic. And they take the view that the United States needs to be without any global competition and has to be the dominant country in the world. And many Americans believe that this is somehow even a God-given right of Americans to be the dominant country. It's a very dangerous idea because we should be looking for a world in which prosperity is shared everywhere. And it's a simple arithmetical fact that as China becomes more prosperous, because there are more people in China than in the United States, it will become a bigger economy than the United States. That's not something I worry about. This is just natural that as prosperity is shared, of course China will be the largest economy because it is the most people, together with India, and has a rapidly rising income. But this has made a lot of American politicians very disorganized in their thinking, and especially if you are like Trump, who is a very virulent nationalist. It's only America, only America. It's not about the world. This is the reaction. It's, in my opinion, very dangerous and very destructive. But in the meantime, I don't think that China should also be pulled into the American controversy so much because there are 193 countries in the UN. And that means other than the US and China, there are 191 other countries. And I would urge China to have good relations with those other 191 countries because that will make the world safer and make the world better for China too. We need cooperation. And the United States is in a very non-cooperative mood right now, anti-cooperative. But I wouldn't let that provoke China to become anti-cooperative also. I would rather see China become even more cooperative with other countries to point out the difference with the behavior of one country that says America first, but China says the whole world together. And I think that this is the right approach. Well, we face very complex challenges, and we should approach them with rationality and with seriousness. And so if it's COVID-19 or if it's climate change or if it's fighting poverty, the goal should be to solve these problems through rational cooperation. And rational cooperation means good analysis and then cooperative implementation. COVID-19 is not a case for conflict. It's a case for cooperation. We need to end this virus, get it under control everywhere. Climate change can only be solved if we're acting cooperatively. And so the problem is when politicians like Trump try to stir up fear and hate. Unfortunately, in our human nature, it's possible to do that with many people, and then the situation can be very dangerous. I'm hoping that we'll have the opportunity soon to reset normal, constructive relations. And what I would recommend is serious work as our two countries, the United States and China, round the year at a very professional level, working together on all of the issues of common interest, not just a meeting at a G20 once a year, but US, China, European Union, and others who want to partner, cooperative, ongoing, professional, intensive problem solving. Because if we did that, there's hardly a problem on the planet that we couldn't solve together. Well, I personally take note of the fact that China, in its modern history and in its tradition, has been a stable country for longer than any other place in the world. And it has not, in the last 40 years, for example, been engaged in any war overseas, and one brief war before that. And in the meantime, the United States has been engaged in probably about a dozen wars since 1980. So I think that there's no question that we could have a peaceful world, and that it is in China's interest for peace, and it's in America's interest for peace also. And when people claim that China is an aggressive country, well, that's ridiculous. I say, look in the mirror and let's understand that we shouldn't be making accusations. We should be constructively discussing issues. And the US has launched a lot more wars, unfortunately, in the last 40 years than any other major power. And that's a big problem, because war has not solved any of the political problems that led to those conflicts at all. So it's just a bad, outdated, antiquated policy to view political issues through military means. The problem is that when you have this kind of very heated rhetoric, we can end up in a very dangerous arms race, and we can end up with accidental confrontations. All of this worries me a lot, because the last Cold War that we had in the United States with the Soviet Union was a very dangerous period and a huge waste of human effort. And it led to a lot of conflict, and on a couple of occasions to near complete global disaster. So we don't want to go anywhere close to that history again. You know, university means universe. It means everything included. And so at a university, global cooperation is very normal. And throughout the history of universities for hundreds of years, in fact, thousands of years, universities have been connected with each other. And I direct for the United Nations a network of universities called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that has many Chinese universities as partners, for example. And this is normal. But then, as part of this very, very bad idea of the extreme nationalism of Trump, they're trying to stop this kind of cooperation right now because they say, oh, China's taking our technology as if it's American technology rather than world know-how, and as if somehow you can stop the spread of knowledge by shutting a visa. It's a very self-defeating and dangerous process because we need the interconnections. I'm so proud of my students that I've had from China for 4 decades who are now senior officials and leaders in finance and in other sectors, and they make me very proud. They were extremely nice young people when I first met them. Now they're extremely nice older people and very, very successful. And so this has been one of the great points of contact.
Jeffrey Sachs speaking there about the interconnectedness between global poverty alleviation and sustainable development. Our next speaker will be discussing the contribution that China's development model has had on the international community. Kishore Mahbubani is Singapore's former ambassador to the United Nations. Here's a short video about him.
It's truly a great honor to be invited to address this conference on China and the UN, poverty elimination and peaceful development. Let me begin with a paradoxical statement. It was my good fortune to be born poor. Now this sounds strange. Poverty is painful. It is therefore bad. So why was it good for me to be born poor? It was good for 2 reasons. Firstly, people who overcome poverty are stronger people. Adversity can make us stronger and more resilient. And in that sense, it has helped me. Secondly, my personal experience with poverty has enabled me to understand how the vast majority of the world's population has lived in recent decades. Please let me stress that I did not experience extreme poverty in Singapore. We always had a roof over our heads. However, at the age of 6, when I went to school, I was put in a special feeding program because I was technically undernourished. We had no flush toilet in our home till I was 13 years old. We also experienced social problems associated with poverty, ethnic riots, gang fights. Innocent people were killed in my neighborhood. That's what happens when you have poverty and social dysfunction. I'm telling this story because many of the people who write about human rights are Western writers who were born and grew up in affluent societies. So they have no understanding of the more fundamental needs of poor people. Instead, for example, they emphasize the importance of the right to vote. So what is the importance of the right to vote if we do not have enough to eat? So this is why all people who promote human rights should emphasize that before we can enjoy all the human rights, we must first have the ability to exercise 5 fundamental human rights. 1, the right to live in safety without being killed. 2, the right to have enough to eat to avoid starvation. 3, the right to basic medical care. 4, the right to education. 5, the right to a job with income to feed a family. Now, if we don't enjoy these 5 rights, we cannot enjoy all the other human rights. And these 5 rights are fundamental. This is why the recent story of China is a very important story for the rest of the world to understand. In the past 40 years, China has delivered these 5 basic rights to its people faster and more comprehensively than any other country has done in human history. And the reason why this accomplishment is even more remarkable is that before these 40 years, the majority of the Chinese people had their lives threatened from foreign invasions, from civil wars, from famine and starvation, from lack of medical care, from lack of access to modern education, and from massive unemployment. Indeed, the Chinese people suffered a great deal in their century of humiliation from the Opium War in 1842 to the establishment of modern China in 1949. It's important to understand the very difficult conditions from which the Chinese people came before their recent developments to understand how far they have come. And it is also true that for the longest part of Chinese history, for thousands of years, the living conditions of Chinese people in the rural areas did not improve. The vast majority of Chinese peasants led very hard lives, struggling to stay afloat. They had barely enough to eat, no access to education or health care. Their life expectancy was also very low. So here are some statistics that bring out how remarkable China's development has been. As recently as 1980, as I said earlier, close to 100% of the Chinese people in the rural areas experienced poverty. By 2016, 36 years later, rural poverty had declined by 95.5%. And if you look at the entire population of China, the figures on poverty reduction are equally strong. In 1980, over 90% of the total population of China of 981 million was living below US $3.20 a day. By 2016, the number had fallen to 5.4%. That's a remarkable reduction. Equally importantly, the number of school children who had access to secondary school education went up from 43% in 1980 to 88% in 2010. And the number in tertiary education in universities went up from 1.13% in 1980 to 50.6% in 2018. Similarly, the percentage of people with access to medical clinics went up. And the number of hospitals in China went up from about 10,000 in 1980 to over 33,000 in 2018. And hospital beds per 1,000 people went up from 2.23 in 1980 to 4.2 in 2012. And here is an interesting contrast. In the United States, hospital beds per 1,000 people went down from 6 in 1980 to 2.9 in 2013. We still don't know why this happened. And therefore, it is not surprising that in China, the life expectancy went up from 66.8 years in 1980 to 76.7 years in 2018. Now, this Chinese story of unprecedented human development is important for the world to understand for one important reason. Even in the year 2020, there are still many people living below the poverty line in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The respective numbers are 53.9% for South Asia, 12.5% for East Asia, 68.1% for Sub-Saharan Africa, and 10.4% for Latin America. And this makes up a total of 2 billion people, or 26.4% of the world's population, who live in extreme poverty. So the most important thing we need to do for these 2 billion people is to rescue them from poverty. And until recently, many economists thought that eliminating poverty was a mission impossible. But the story of China tells us that in poverty reduction, a mission impossible can become a mission possible. This is why we need to spread this story about China to every corner of the world. But the big question remains, why did China succeed? And here the answer is that China carried out some correct policies both domestically and internationally to achieve these poverty reduction goals. On the domestic front, when I was Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, I told the students at the school that for countries to succeed, they should follow the magical MPH formula. Now, MPH does not stand for miles per hour. It stands for meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. And the one thing that China has been able to do is to improve the quality of governance in China by implementing meritocracy. Meritocracy means that the Chinese government was able to select the best people to work and serve in many agencies of government. And when you have good governance, you can have the right policies to improve people's lives. P stands for pragmatism. And the best definition for pragmatism actually comes from the late Chinese leader, the great Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, who said it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, if it catches mice, it is a good cat. China had this unique ability to select the best policies from the world, learn the best practices, and implement them in a pragmatic fashion. So pragmatism is another thing we need to learn from China if you want to understand how we can use it to solve many of the problems in the world. H stands for honesty. At the end of the day, as history teaches us, the countries that succeed are the ones that are able to fight corruption and ensure that the resources of the state are used to help the people rather than to be put in private pockets in different places. And the record on honesty is a mixed one for virtually all countries in the world. And this is also why the MPH formula is important to understand. At the same time, on the international front, China has carried out the right policies by integrating itself into the liberal rules-based international order. The data will show clearly that China's poverty came down very sharply after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. So countries that want to remove poverty should open themselves up to international trade. And China has done this in a spectacular fashion because it has now become the #1 trading power in the world. And if you had a graph in front of you, you would see that as China's international trade went up, its poverty rates went down. There was a clear correlation. I say all this because since I've escaped from poverty personally, I can confidently say that there's no more noble mission in the world than poverty reduction. If the whole world can replicate China's experience in poverty reduction, we would then have achieved the greatest improvement in the human condition since human history began. It therefore gives me great pleasure to wish this conference great success. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mahbubani speaking there from his personal experience on the importance of poverty reduction and how China has succeeded in achieving the seemingly impossible mission by the MPH formula, which stands for meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. Wonderful speech. Thanks again, sir. And our next speaker is Johannes Grabler, former senior diplomat in the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation, and he will be discussing how Africa and other developing countries can benefit from China's development model. And here is a short video about him.
indeed an honor for me to be part of this very commendable China Daily initiative and to talk about Africa and China. The contact and the growing friendship between China and Africa has a history of several thousands of years, but it's only after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 and after Africa had begun to rid itself of the burden of colonialism in the 50s and the 60s, regaining their independence, that substantive cooperation between China and Africa was actively resumed in the 50s and the 60s. China and Africa supported each other very strongly in the fight against colonialism, as both countries were in fact victims of imperialism, and China constantly assisted Africa to win its independence and in its pursuit of development. In fact, China and Africa's cooperation entered a new and exciting era in this period, which coincided with the holding of the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in April 1955, attended by 25 countries, which shaped the future of Afro-Asian and anti-colonial solidarity and South-South cooperation. The 5 principles, the very important principles of peaceful coexistence, and adopted by the conference, formed the core of the deliberations at the Bandung Conference, and where China played a constructive and reconciliatory role. These principles, these very important principles, to this very day still serve as the underlying fundamentals of the rapidly expanding China and Africa friendship and partnership. Africa took a firm decision based on the sound progress that was being made in its cooperation with China, that China should in future be involved constructively in the emergence of Africa, and in fact that any attempt to isolate China should be rejected. As a concrete example of this is that the United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly voted on 25 October 1971 to restore China's lawful rights to the United Nations, with strong support from many African countries. Although consistent progress was made regarding China and Africa cooperation, it could be said that the year 2000 initiated a new vital and game-changing phase of China and Africa cooperation on a much higher, intensive and more comprehensive level. That was with the creation of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, in October 2000 in Beijing. And since then, China-Africa relations has entered a new phase of rapid, focused and comprehensive cooperation. Today, China is Africa's largest trading partner, and with investment growing daily. FOCAC prospered significantly since 2000, and in 2018 culminated in the Beijing FOCAC summit, which was highly constructive and productive. President Xi Jinping, on that occasion, proposed the 8 major initiatives which would in future give huge stimulus to FOCAC, the FOCAC process. Let me now turn to Africa's admiration and respect for China's development model. It is against the background I just described of strong and growing cooperation and extensive contact and exchanges between China and Africa that Africa developed a deep respect and admiration for China's development model. Africa witnessed the profound changes and progress in China and the progress that China had made over the last 70 years, based on reform, opening up, and innovation, under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, the CPC, embarking on a path of socialism with Chinese characteristics and achieving remarkable outcomes by creating a moderately prosperous society and continuing to grow, which is really generally regarded as a miracle of development and which is unmatched worldwide. Africa noted and admired how China has always adopted its own road and formed its own development path with innovative experiments based on its own conditions, experiences, and lessons. How China has upheld a philosophy of people-centered development, directing all its efforts towards fulfilling the people's aspirations for a better life and achieving significant progress with its targeted poverty alleviation program, particularly launched by the CPC in 2012. Africa also witnessed the Chinese people's very strong belief in the direction adopted by their leaders, where the people come first. Corruption is rooted out, all of which has led to an unprecedented level of internal political stability in China, which has brought honor to China's history and its future. Africa also admires China's quest for self-reliance and hard work, and how over the last few decades they have rebuilt the country, opening up new horizons and opportunities, as well as the ability of China to implement policy with a fierce focus on long-term thinking and planning, and in which the focus on implementation of policies is central. Africa also saw how China became the second largest economy in the world, and how it became an important engine of global economic growth. In fact, China is already playing right now a key role in the world economic recovery in the post-COVID world. Because of the challenges of urbanization in Africa, Africa's noted the constructive urbanization policy of China, bridging and integrating urban and rural and intergenerational worlds with great success, contributing to remarkable growth and development in your country. Africa has admiration for China's phenomenal progress in science and technology, research and innovation. Inter alia in the vital digital economy, high-speed trains, green economy and renewable energy, all of which have provided strong support for social and economic development in China. And lastly, Africa values the Belt and Road Initiative, which is based on principles of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits, and characterized by peace, cooperation, openness, and inclusiveness. Africa equally, as I mentioned earlier on, welcomes the Forum on China and Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, which has become a vital and central platform for future China-Africa friendship and cooperation from China's development model. Africa regards China's development as an opportunity for the world rather than a threat. And above all, Africa sees it as a significant and growing contribution on the part of China to global development, economic growth, peace and stability. In fact, China's growth model and success have inspired and gave confidence to other developing countries around the world in their endeavors to achieve development and to give momentum to their approach towards modernization and enhanced prosperity. An outstanding and encouraging aspect is that China is prepared to share its expertise and experiences with other countries that want to speed up their economic growth and development, and it enables them, the China model enables them to choose a development path in accordance with their own national requirements and conditions. China's strong opposition to hegemonism in whatever form, as well as against unilateralism, protectionism, and trade bullying, and its consistent position that it will not seek to progress at the expense of others, is appreciated by Africa and the developing world. The spread of COVID-19 has not only put health systems in African countries increasingly under pressure, but has also had far-reaching implications for the continent, which could contribute to the slowing down of the commendable political, economic and social progress that Africa has made over the last few decades. Africa wishes and would like to draw on China's development experiences in so many areas which I mentioned earlier. Africa, a continent which has enormous potential and which has been described by President Xi Jinping as I quote, a continent of hope, unquote, Africa is also in the process of realizing its own dream by implementing its strategic vision of the African Union's Agenda 2063, which basically encapsulates Africa's future growth and its development plan to become a prosperous, stable and peaceful continent. It is critical for Africa to have the ability to take its own decisions and to promote its own preferred homegrown development course. Africa must ultimately take responsibility for its own destiny. And I know that China accepts this because China listens to Africa's voice. Given the long-standing relationship between China and Africa, based on mutual respect, quality, mutual benefit, and a win-win situation, it is expected that China and Africa will increasingly cooperate closer, also drawing on the lessons of China's unique development model, and which will continue to bring tangible and lasting benefits to both the continent as well as to China in these challenging times. China has indeed been a reliable partner for Africa, always honoring its commitments in an efficient, pragmatic and results-oriented manner, which was again demonstrated by China's unselfish and generous support to Africa since the outbreak of COVID-19. It can thus be anticipated that FOCAC and the Belt and Road Initiative will grow as platforms for China and Africa to jointly implement cooperation initiatives aimed at accelerating and increasingly working towards a number of priorities which I will now list. The first is the need to see the continued alignment of the Africa Union's Agenda 2063 with the Belt and Road Initiative and with FOCAC action plans, with a stepped-up focus on practical outcomes on sustainable economic growth. Another issue is health. We would like to see the improvement of health standards and access to health services. And China has helped a lot and continue to help a lot in this regard. The third issue is that Africa is still deindustrializing. So new industries, new industrialization, diversification, and increasing manufacturing capacity on the continent are all critical. Africa needs to invest more in basic infrastructure such as road, rail, water and sanitation. And China has already done a tremendous job in this regard. Africa needs agricultural modernization, as Africa is still dependent on food imports. What is also important is the promotion of digital economy, information technology application towards the fourth industrial revolution, which is of increasing importance to Africa, which would help Africa to rapidly improve productivity and job creation on the continent. There are the issue of the further development of special economic zones, and with which with which China has already helped Africa to a large extent. There is the enhancement of energy security and development, particularly the green economy and renewable energy, a sector in which China is one of the world leaders. China has been very supportive of Africa's attempts to bring about peace and security on the continent, and has been playing a very important role to help Africa with its initiative to silence the guns on the continent. And of course, lastly, Africa will continue to need humanitarian support. So China and Africa are already actively cooperating on all the points I mentioned. That will be stepped up in the future, also, as I said, learning from the lessons of China's remarkable economic development growth plan. China indeed remains for Africa a valued partner, particularly given the fragile global political and economic situation, division, and leadership challenges that many countries in the West face. In fact, Africa and China are now, as we speak, busy charting the way forward on cooperation in the post-pandemic era, as was illustrated by the outcome of the successful extraordinary China and Africa Summit on Solidarity against COVID-19. China and Africa also agreed that through joint efforts, the Belt and Road Initiative should be strengthened, and to also broaden cooperation on trade, investment, connectivity, and digital economy. Let me refer in conclusion to the wise words of President Xi Jinping, who once stated, and I quote President Xi Jinping, I quote, that China will treat Africa with sincerity, that China will seek to deliver real outcomes in conducting cooperation with Africa, resolve problems that may occur with good faith, and continue to build a close friendship with Africa, unquote. Those were the wise words of President Xi Jinping. These are very compelling and endearing words that Africa appreciates. Africa knows that China respects Africa's values, understands Africa's challenges, and furthermore that China listens to Africa's voice, and that China is prepared to continue its development, to share its development experience with Africa as a friend in need in the challenging times we are living and the challenging road ahead. I thank you.
Mr. Grabler giving us a vivid account there of the ever-growing friendship between China and Africa. The rapid development of China is a positive force on the overall improvement of the global economy, allowing developing countries to draw on China's experience in their efforts to achieve prosperity. Our next guest speaker will discuss China's peaceful rise, its relationship with the United States and the world. Martin Sachs is a Senior Fellow of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University. Here's a short video about him.
China's rise from 1978 took place in a relatively stable international environment. And at the core of this was the relatively benign relationship between the United States and China. There were two fundamental assumptions that underpinned America's attitude towards China over this period. The first was that China was so far behind economically that it was virtually impossible to imagine China becoming an economic challenger or threat to American economic ascendancy in the world. And the second factor, and I think more important factor, was that the American belief was that as China modernized, it would westernize. Because remember, the American attitude fundamentally was that the process of modernization was also a process of westernization. So the American assumption was that over time, China would become increasingly look like a Western country, look like the United States, have, for example, centrally, a Western-style political system. And so this was the other aspect. And the Americans took it for granted that if this didn't happen, then China's rise would come to an end, hit a wall, be unsustainable. Now, what began to undermine these two American assumptions about China really starts with the financial crisis, Western financial crisis, in 2008. This was the beginning of the turning point. Now, this was completely unexpected. America had not experienced a financial crisis like this since 1931. And America was in big trouble. The West was in big trouble during this period. And to be frank, it's never really recovered. Its growth rates have been, until the pandemic, which is a different story, have been very low. Interest rates have been extremely low. To some extent, the Western economy has been on a life support system. Meanwhile, China has been in a completely different situation during this period. I mean, China was, of course, affected by it, but basically, China continued to grow at more or less the same rate as it had before. And by 2014, extraordinary, China overtook the United States in terms of GDP primary purchasing power, according to this measure from the World Bank. China, by this time, also, on an annual basis, was contributing something like 1/3, was accounting for 1/3 of global economic growth. So you see, there's a chasm in the experience, on the one hand of the West, and the United States in particular, where it all started, and on the other hand, China. But there was something else we must add to this picture. And that was, remember, politics. The economic crisis was expected by the West to happen in China. It happened in the West. The political crisis was expected by the West to happen in China. It happened in the West. Because what happened was that there was growing discontent, unease, dissent, anxiety, anger in the West about the impact of the financial crisis on people's living standards and so on. And you got the rise of growing dissatisfaction, particularly amongst traditional working class people and so on in the States and elsewhere, and the rise of what we came to know as populism. So this was a really important moment which began to undermine the situation in the West, both economically and politically. And with the consequence that there was also, because of the contrasting experience on the one hand of the West, on the other hand China, a growing anxiety in the West, and particularly in governing circles, but not only in governing circles, about the challenge of China. China, our partner, as it were, since 1972, was seen increasingly as a threat. There was growing anxiety, there was growing hostility towards China as a result of this. And so eventually, of course, this culminates in the election of Trump in 2016 as American president. But this was not just a matter of the Republicans. This new attitude of hostility towards China was pretty bipartisan. Now, why couldn't America tolerate the rise of China? Why does it immediately translate China's rise into the China threat? And here we have to, I think, understand the psychology of an imperial power and the United States in particular. You see, the Americans are extraordinary over a very long historical period, centuries, have always kind of been on the rise. And since 1945, they've been overwhelmingly the kind of global hegemon. The idea that America is number one is part of the American DNA. It's not just the presidents and the congressmen and so on who believe this. This is deeply imbued, I think, in the average American. The Americans think they're best. The Americans think they have to be top dogs. They're not going to be bossed around by anyone else. They're not going to be rivaled by anyone else. Now, of course, the reality is rather different, historically speaking, because no country can ever expect to be number one forever. Think of China, the century of humiliation. China was displaced. And so this was the case with Britain and so on. And this will be the case with the United States. America's relative economic decline probably starts around the 1980s. But the Americans have basically been in denial of this. Even to this day, they're largely in denial. It would be suicide for an American president to say, we are in decline and we cannot change that situation. We have to accommodate ourselves to a new world. Americans are not ready for this kind of argument. So, what was the American response to China as a threat? Essentially, the American response was an assault against China, to find a way of making China's rise more difficult, to prevent China's rise if possible, if not at least obstruct China's rise. And so, after Trump becomes president, you see after a short while the beginning of the trade war. And then after the trade war, or alongside the trade war, the tech war. And steadily, as the acrimonious and abrasive approach to China developed, you see action being taken against China on all sorts of different fronts. I would argue now, I think probably it would be appropriate to call the situation that the world is now in and the relationship between the United States and China as a new Cold War. But just because we use the term Cold War doesn't mean we should confuse or conflate this Cold War with the one between the United States and the Soviet Union. There are three fundamental differences between them. The first is that the United States and the Soviet Union lived and occupied two entirely different economic worlds. Never the twain shall meet. They just had two different international systems, one belonging to the United States, the other to the Soviet Union. Now, of course, this is not the situation with China. China is hugely integrated with the global economy. Indeed, I would argue that in some respects it's more integrated with the global economy than is true of the United States. I mean, take for one thing trade. I mean, China is a much more important trading nation, exporting and importing, than the United States. Now, whatever the Americans say, whatever the Trump administration would like to do, they will not be able to excise China from the global economy. They can go about it, but they won't get that far, in my view. They can't take, as it were, take China out of the global economy. It is simply too important. It is too integrated. Its relations with so many countries around the world are too advanced for that to happen. My second point is the Soviet Union was never an economic peer or equal of the United States. At most, it had maybe accounted for maybe 60% the size of the American economy. Probably less, probably more like half. Now, you cannot say that of China. China already in 2014, as we've seen, had overtaken the size of the American economy measured by primary purchasing power, GDP. Now, it is generally expected that within the next few years, maybe 5 years, depends partly on the impact of the pandemic, that China will overtake the United States by the other measure of GDP, which is in dollar terms. And if we extend the time horizon a bit further, you'll see the picture of the global economy by roughly 2030. Now, all these figures are obviously projections, so they're obviously, they're not facts. But you'll see, it gives you some idea that by 2030, China could account, this is by PPP, GDP, PPP, could account for 1/3 of global GDP. By which time it will be something like twice the size of the American economy. Already by this measure, by the way, it is 20% bigger than the American economy. And you'll see also that even when you combine the American economy and the EU, China will be larger than both put together. So, the rise of China economically is formidable. And it is deeply embedded, and it is showing its ability to perform in many different areas, including, of course, technology. The third point I would make is that the Soviet Union made a fundamental mistake in its relationship with the United States, and that was the arms race. It tried to compete militarily with the United States, and it's spent so much money, wasted such resources in a disastrous approach. China won't make that mistake. China won't make that mistake for two reasons. One, China doesn't emphasize the military in a way that, for example, the United States does or the Soviet Union did. And so China's approach is much more the fundamental importance of the economic. I think the prospect is that we are looking at this kind of situation we've got now, the Cold War and antagonistic relationship between the United States and China for the foreseeable future. And it's impossible to predict how long. But you can say, or I would argue, that the condition for a change in this antagonism depends on a shift in the American position. You see, the Americans are insisting that they should enjoy sole primacy in the world. And this is no longer possible. This atmosphere and relationship will change is the moment when the United States comes to the view that it must share primacy in the world with China. And that will be the precondition for, I think, a new turn in the relationship between the United States and China. Many voices in American leadership have attacked China on a number of different, all sorts of questions, all sorts of issues. And I will just talk about three here. The first is the argument that's come from the Trump administration that China's only got to where it is by cheating, by copying, by bullying American companies and other Western companies for technology transfer and so on. Look, there is not a single country in the world that has ever gone up the economic chain by not borrowing from other countries. I mean, what did America do when it started to try and industrialize? It borrowed very heavily, i.e. copied, i.e. stole, if you like, from German companies. And so what China's done is absolutely no different, in my view, from what essentially has been the story of innovation worldwide throughout the industrial era. So what China's doing is not different from what it's been doing essentially since 1978. The difference is this, that China is now far stronger, far more advanced than it was previously. And the American criticism of China are not because they're doing something different, it's because they've travelled a long way and are now a very serious competitor for the United States. Now, of course, we see the trade war, the tech war. Let me just say something briefly about the trade war and the tech war. Fundamentally, the trade war is not going to work. I mean, it's going to damage China, but it's probably going to damage the United States more than it damages China. It's damaged the rest of the world as well, by the way. But essentially, I think probably the biggest sufferer of the two will be the United States. Or take the tech war. Actually, this is going to fail. Again, it's causing damage to China. It's caused damage to Huawei, particularly on the issue of chips. But it's not going to succeed because China's innovative energy, innovative potential, innovative dynamic is just too strong now. And quite frankly, I expect over the next 10 years to see China becoming the technological leader in many, many new areas compared with the United States. Now, this brings me to my second point, and I think one of the most depressing, in fact, one of the most disgraceful episodes in Western attitudes towards China was to do with the pandemic, COVID-19. I mean, in January, China was struggling to understand what the pandemic was, to identify it, and to work out how to deal with it. And the West, particularly the Americans, but not only the Americans, my own country, Britain, for sure, relentlessly attacked China. You know, cover up, secrecy, you're not telling us the truth, you're covering up, the survival of the government the party matters more than the survival of people. And so these were the kind of arguments that were dredged up. This was in a situation where China was struggling in great difficulty. Remember, China was the first to tackle the question of COVID-19. Now, and you can see that actually China's performance on COVID-19, certainly from late January, was brilliant. I mean, these figures here are on the basis of per capita, the number of deaths per capita. Look at China. Probably the strongest performance of any country in the world, even though it had to tackle COVID-19 before anyone else. And all those great critics, the United States and other Western countries, my own United Kingdom and so on, who could not stop themselves attacking China, showed no compassion in January, have had those 2 extra months to deal with it, could have learned from China, and look at them, a miserable performance. And I would say this, in addition, that the pandemic has been, perhaps above all, a test of governance. And without question, China has come through this fundamentally with flying colours. And the United States has been proven under the Trump leadership, but I think, unfortunately, more generally, to have been incompetent. And the fact that China's now coming out of the pandemic, of course, has created major economic opportunities. There's only one country of this list here that is going to have positive growth in terms of GDP in 2020, and that is China. Everyone else, look at that, minus 8% these are IMF projections, 8% decline for the United States, 10% for the UK, and so on. My last point is this. It's about the criticism of China, that it doesn't observe the rule of law, that it doesn't observe the norms of the international system, and so on. This has been, you find this kind of criticism very frequently. And I think we need to be clear about certain things here. First point, China had no say in the present rules and norms of the international system. They were all developed by the United States and Western Europe. So China was not a party to the international system. Nevertheless, China has since, with its growth and its rise, has been a very good global citizen in the UN, in the WTO, in the IMF, in the World Bank. China has played a very positive role, and China has always been very generous in its praise for the international system and the way it has been a beneficiary of that system. Let me just say something else as well here. You know, since China's rise started in 1978, China has not really been involved in any wars whatsoever. This is the period of China's great rise, great transformation from nothing to now being equal with the most powerful country in the world economically. Now look at American history, or German history, or British history, or Japanese history. All of these countries were involved in many wars during the equivalent period of their historical development. China, in other words, has exercised extraordinary restraint during this period of its development. Now, I would say this, and that is, I don't believe the present international system can survive for a long time. And the reason is quite simply this. We live in a completely different world, a rapidly changing world. In 1980, the centre of the global economy was here. And then slowly, in the subsequent 30-odd years, it shifted. You can see it shifting here. And today, it's somewhere about here. That's the centre of the global economy. In those days, the global economy was essentially Western Europe and the United States. By 2050, it'll be here, basically on the Indian-China border. There's no way you can have an international system which is controlled by, essentially, and privileges the United States and Western Europe when actually the centre of the action is over here. You need a different kind of global economy, a different kind of global order for that kind of situation. And I would say this in relationship to this new international system. First of all, at the heart of it will be China, 18% of the world's population. At the heart of the present international system is the United States, just 4.3% of the world's population. Secondly, this increasingly, what we're witnessing is the rise of the developing world and the decline of the developed world. Today, it's something like this. 39% of the global economy is accounted for by the developed world. 61% is accounted for by the developing world. By 2030, it'll be something like this. This will be the Western world plus Japan, and this will be the developing world. In the developing world, 85%, something like 85% of the world's population live. In this part of the world, less than 15%. In other words, we're talking about an international system which will be far more representative of humanity than it is now. In other words, we're moving from an essentially authoritarian, minoritarian system of global governments to something which is far more representative of the world as it is already, and as it will be even more so in the future. So I see China's role as essentially very positive in terms of the future. I think there's something else that needs to be said here, and that is that the rise of China, not just China, the rise of the developing world as well, of which China, of course, is part, is creating a big crisis in the West. I would call it the existential crisis of the West. Because for 200 years, the West has run the world, has assumed that the world is its world, has been at the heart of all the major institutions which it has designed. The assumption that its people will run the world, that its language, now English, will dominate, that the people who run the world by and large will be white. This era is coming to an end. This era is no longer sustainable. It's not just the rise of China, it's the rise of the developing world as well. And you're experiencing in the West now a backlash against this process. And this change is not just happening in the United States, it's a global change. It's the rise of different peoples, different colours, different languages, different cultures, different civilizations. I like the Chinese expression, inclusive civilization, but the West has got no idea how to embrace that. So this is a very important aspect of what we're talking about. And I'll just finish by saying this. Look, I regard China's rise to be extraordinarily positive. That doesn't mean that China doesn't make mistakes, hasn't made mistakes, won't make mistakes in the future. Of course it will. It's on a learning curve. It's only just really beginning to be a great power. But China is a very good learner. We can all see that. Thank you.
Martin Jacques there sharing his insights into the peaceful rise of China, its relationship with the US and the international governance system. Thank you, sir.
Well, that's all we have time for this edition of Vision China. We've been treated some real insights in terms of how China and the United Nations have worked together to achieve common goals. And we've also seen the many achievements between the two in the past.
We have learned how sustainable development is a universal goal for all nations, and how China's development model is benefiting other developing countries from around the world.
For the latest updates, visit www.chinadaily.com.cn, download the China Daily app, or follow China Daily on WeChat, Weibo, Facebook, or Twitter. Stay tuned for upcoming Vision China events, where we'll be discussing key issues concerning mutual understanding facing China and the world.
Thanks for watching. Good night.
Good night.